Welcome to the show. We have guests Christopher Sharp of Liberation Times and James Iandoli of Engaging the Phenomenon. Today we are going to discuss mostly Lue Elizondo's recently published book, published on August 20th. It's titled Imminent, Inside the Pentagon's Hunt for UFOs. The former head of the program responsible for investigating UAPs reveals profound secrets. I want to start with you, Chris. This is a question that's not directly related to his book, but I think it's essential, and I want to know for myself and for my audience. The UAP Disclosure Act is being reinstituted. What was taken out the first time Congress tried to get it passed that's so essential that Congress is now trying to get back into the legislation and get it passed in full?
Oh my gosh, great question. I mean, there was so much that was taken out of it. I mean, the review board being, I think, a really, really big one in terms of having an independent review board and having the archivists from the United States government go through all the UFO files and dating back decades. The terminology as well, that was really, really important. Non-human intelligence, unknown origin, very, very important terms, because, I mean, you can get away with basically saying that, we've not found alien life or extraterrestrials and stuff like that. But I think a lot of the time, we see these things as being non-human intelligence instead. So that's very, very important to have in legislation, that terminology, non-human intelligence and what it means. But I think even more important is the unknown origin stuff, because I think what happens is that a lot of the time with these retrievals is that the US government will find them in terms of the CIA and whatever special operations forces they're working with. And what will happen is they'll determine, look, it's advanced, we don't know where it's from. Okay, let's shift it off to the contractor. And then the contractor will likely do the evaluation and give a best estimate of where it may be from. And even then, like, how can you even say it's from this planet or it's from this planet? How can you definitively say? So I think the unknown origin stuff is really important, because it gives the US government plausible deniability, saying there's nothing of non-human intelligence being discovered, because they can't positively identify it as such. Although they can say it's advanced, and they can say that it's of unknown origin, we just don't know where it's from. And then I guess as well, I think the eminent domain was really important as well. Everyone has their opinions on it, but in reality, eminent domain, there is a precedent of that in US law already. If the government wanted to take over Skinwalker Ranch tomorrow, they could start proceedings on that. They can start that process. Obviously, there are really fundamental flaws with that. How do you put a value on, a craft of non-human intelligence that has technology that would completely change the world and transform it? So there are major problems, but I thought that was quite important as well, and kind of like being a stick. Okay, if you don't actually, come forward and cooperate with us, we do have this thing that we can use, this lever. So I thought that was really, really important as well. So, but I mean, there are other things in there. It's such a long bit of text, and obviously it was completely gutted last time round, and it was really quite meaningless in my understanding.
Okay. And James, what I want to ask you is, someone on Twitter recently wrote, "The government is never going to tell you the truth about UFOs. Just go outside at night, humble yourself, and look up. Ask to see. That easy." And the reason I'm bringing this up is because a lot of people in the UFO community do have this attitude that you don't need the government. You can bypass the government. We don't need people like David Grush. We don't need people like Lue Elizondo and Chris Mellon. We can just have open or private communication with the phenomena itself. So in that context, James, do you think Lue has wasted his time coming forward in October 11th, 2017, and then continuing his charge to pressure the U.S. government to be transparent on this topic, because we can just engage the phenomenon ourselves out in the field? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I understand where people are coming from when they make a comment like that, right? You, to some extent, you can have a personal disclosure, right? You can know that there's something there, but I mean, that doesn't mean you should let the government off the hook either, right? It's an obligation for them. They're supposed to serve the people in this country and the United States. So I get the distrust, right? So they've lied to us for so many decades about this. Even if they did tell us the truth, how could you trust it? So there's a lot of different levels to that conversation. I do think that the transparency effort is important because it's, people having their own personal disclosures. If you're talking about experiencers and contactees and abductees and whatnot, who has the answer then? All right. I mean, you have 1,000 different disclosures for 1,000 different experiencers. They're being, for whatever reason, not everybody's coming forward with the same information that's an experiencer, right? There's no unison kind of, I mean, there's overarching themes, but if the information is there, right? Like if the U.S. government and our taxpayer dollars have contributed to obtaining all this information and researching it, we have a right to know what that is, right? And we're going to have a lot more people working on it. We're seeing that now with the transparency already. We have all these academics now, from Diana Pasolka, Jeffrey Kripal, Jacques Vallée has been involved forever. But yeah, I mean, there's every week there's a new academic who's coming out with a UFO related book, and you need that kind of collective effort to take on a topic such as this. And if everybody has their own kind of personal disclosure and there's no collective effort to come to an idea of truth, we're not going to, it's like all these silos of different messages and information from the phenomenon. And even with that, we don't even know if individuals are interacting with a singular intelligence or different intelligences. It's hard to make sense of all the information that's there as well, right? At least if with transparency, if there is some kind of formal disclosure, number one, that's going to convince the scientific community more or less, right? And the academics and get people kind of together on the issue. Whereas if everybody's just having their own personal disclosures, for them, that's great. I get that. I understand that it's important that people can have that realization. But I think the overall UAP transparency effort, it's because it represents more than just UFOs, right? It's about accountability and again, maybe rebuilding a little bit of trust in this country, in the United States, and globally. It's really about so much more than I know that UFOs are real now. Well, then what, right? Okay, but if we have a collective disclosure, we can actually maybe unite behind that and do something about it collectively, right? There's going to be other things that come from a UAP transparency and a collective disclosure that is not going to happen from somebody having, although it's important to have some kind of personal disclosure and realization. If there is a disclosure, then the government, so to speak, is going to have to answer for that and everything that follows. So it's not going to stop there. That's the beginning of the whole kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Because you hear people saying like, well, we're going to bypass the government. We're going to do disclosure ourselves. But the outcome is going to be exactly the same. Because if you bypass the government and you get disclosure yourself, which is a very theoretical concept, the U.S. government is still going to have to chime in and be like, oh, okay, well, here's our perspective on it. It's not like the U.S. government is going to remain silent on the reality of the phenomenon after a bunch of CE5ers forced like this event that made it a reality for all 8 billion of us. So whether you bypass the government or you don't bypass the government is never truly going to get bypassed, because the government as an entity is going to enter the conversation either way. And I feel like, the more data, the better. It's wonderful, people who have their own personal experiences, but if you don't include the phenomenon's interaction with governments, now you're taking such a big part of the puzzle piece away. So you're only going to have the puzzle piece that involves people's personal experiences, but you're not going to have, for example, all of the data on UAP doing intrusions into nuclear facilities, or maybe governments have made agreements with some of these civilizations, and wouldn't we want to know about that? Like, I get it, you want to go out in the field and make contact, but I'm just going to speak for myself. I still want to know, has the U.S. government made deals with non-human intelligences? You can bypass the government all you want, but I still want to know information on that. So it kind of comes down to, I think, the more data, the better. Let's just do both. We can do CE5. We can have our own experiences, and we can also push for transparency. And as you said, it's like accountability. Chris, you wrote an article that you published in the Liberation Times yesterday titled "Nuclear Nightmares and UFOs. Robert Hastings Urges Government Transparency." I recall in your article that you said that AARO, the investigatory organization in the Pentagon to look into the UFO issue, they were not interested in hearing from witnesses from these incursions into nuclear missile sites. What's up with that?
Well, I think it's just the fact that the AARO is basically catch and kill. That they want to shoo the problem away. This is the thing. The main problem was that the AARO and Kirkpatrick and everyone, it was all formed under the office of the Undersecretary of Defense for intelligence. That was the major flaw of it, and they got their own guys in who they knew could do the job, basically, to dismiss it. And everyone was warning before it got put within that office that it was a problem, from Lue Elizondo to Chris Mellon. All of them were urging Congress not to pass this law, which would allow AOIMSG, as it was at the time, to be within that office. But it was too late by the time we got it under the purview of Deputy Secretary of Defense and PDNI, which was really, really sad. And yeah, that's their objective, maybe they have good reason behind that, because, can a government really admit that these things for decades have been acting with impunity, shutting down nuclear launch facilities, and kind of like starting the process of nuclear missiles potentially launching, and they can't do anything about it? I mean, who knows, But I think a lot of these people, witnesses to these events, felt like they weren't being taken seriously. I mean, for example, one major basic thing you do if you're investigating these things and you're taking them seriously, you're asking for who else was present. Who were the other witnesses? What were their names? How can I get in touch with them? That's what you're looking for, because you want to corroborate that testimony. None of that happened when these people being interviewed, unfortunately. And you would think with such a major thing like this, it should be looked at much closer, with much more seriousness. This should be this should be top of the agenda right now. I mean, you think how crazy everyone goes, for the potential of a nuclear accident happening in the Ukraine at the moment. I gave the example of the former Prime Minister, Liz Truss. She spent her final days in office looking at weather charts, just in case there was a tactical nuke that went off in the Ukraine, and where that cloud might go. And the same could have happened with the nuclear plant, Zaporizhzhia, I think you pronounced it, nuclear plant, if there was a fallout there, where would the clouds go? And I mean, it just makes you think that, the fact that these things aren't being taken seriously and they're not investigating them, is it because they don't want it to become a top agenda for Congress and for the president and world leaders to know about, because they know how seriously these things would be taken if they were given, some substance from a US government office? Maybe. But these things, it's so alarming. And from my understanding, these incursions are still happening to the present day, not just to, with ICBMs and nuclear weapons infrastructure, but also with the DOE facilities. We saw the recent cases by Jeremy Corbell and Justin Slaughter, with the Pantex facility, with unknown UAS, as they describe them, basically penetrating those facilities. They like to call them UAS, by the way, because then you don't have to answer any awkward questions about them being completely unknown, not knowing where they were from, such as, whether they're from civilian or China or Russia, or exactly what their capabilities were. If they were from China or Russia, did they have surveillance capabilities? What did they want? And things like that, and if they were very, very advanced, we want to know that as well. Were they from a non-human intelligence? Things like that, and it just gets all pushed under the rug and we never get anywhere. So the fact these people weren't being taken seriously, it's a disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace. And these things should not be hidden from Congress or from the president. And I just feel they are at the moment. And as I said, straight away, when these things are given substance by a US government office, it will become a top agenda for any incoming US president, or any congressional committee.
Yeah, and I don't think the American people or other nations, the people of the United Kingdom or any nation, are going to take well when it finally does come out that it becomes a fact that UAP are very interested in nuclear technology and have been doing incursions with impunity all around the world. That should be part of the universal conversation. The fact that that would remain within the confines of governments to talk about, but not to involve humanity when you consider the stakes and how huge an occurrence that is, I don't think people are going to take well to it. So it blows my mind the extent that the Pentagon and other government organizations are going to. They're really bending over backwards to delay transparency on this issue as much as possible. But of course, the blowback for that's going to be a lot worse, because when it finally comes out, people are going to be less forgiving because they were so stubborn to tell the public up until they couldn't do it anymore. To me, it's from a PR standpoint, it's a horrible strategy. And yeah, so AARO wasn't taking these witnesses seriously. But obviously, the Department of Defense knows full well that UAP are not only interested in nuclear technology, but have been for decades. Do you think that's fair to say, Chris?
Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and the intelligence community. And yeah, they do realize it, and they're not going to come clean about it until you kind of drag them kicking and screaming, unfortunately, which is why we need to keep on casting an eye on this issue.
James, I want to ask you about Project Interloper, which was discussed in Lue Elizondo's book. I'm going to read a very short segment to just set the stage for clarity. But after I do that, I want to get your take, James, on whether you think Project Interloper was a good idea or not, or are we starting to flirt with maybe we shouldn't be doing this with much higher intelligences? But I'll read it real quickly. This is a quote from Lue Elizondo's book, Imminent. We would pick a designated spot in the Atlantic and drop in a huge nuclear footprint, one irresistible to our friends from out of town, as they were later called. Nuclear-powered carriers, nuclear-powered destroyers, nuclear-capable assets, nuclear-powered submarines, all in the same vicinity within a huge body of water. The trap would be set, and obviously they would have surveil the area, trying to collect data on UAP. Do you think that was a good idea, James? And why do you think ultimately it was decided? Because I think Lue said that a lot of people from various intelligence agencies signed off on it, but then it was ultimately from, I guess, very senior officials. It was decided that they did not want to okay the Project Interloper experiment. What do you think about that whole thing, James?
So, our friend Hermes, the Hermetic Penetrator, wrote an article on that, on the baiting a few years ago now. So he was definitely onto something when he wrote that. But I was joking around with somebody, and I think in the article he called it like CE6. I don't know if either jokingly or what have you. But yeah, I was joking around with somebody the other day and said it's like the other coin. It's the other side of the coin of CE5, right? It's an invitation in one regard. As far as a good idea, for their intents and purposes and what they were trying to figure out, absolutely. From a military standpoint and from a strategic standpoint, it was a fantastic idea. But maybe the people who shut it down from up top already knew about this kind of connection, like maybe a Colin Elites-esque type person. And again, the Collins Elite was brought up in the book and in more detail than I thought actually that was going to be provided. And it's funny because although you hear a lot about the Collins Elite saying it's all demons, they seem to know quite a bit about the phenomenon regardless. And even though there's that filter of religion, they seem to be studying it as well, and in a very kind of like scientific base. Because I had mentioned there was a individual who I knew in the research field who has since passed, and he said that his mentor in UFO research was somebody that was in the Collins Elite. And if you look the guy up, the guy is in the defense industry. And when he's talking about the phenomenon, especially for the time he was, given these lectures, he gave a few lectures and wrote a few books. And it has, again, the religious framework around it. But then he's talking about physics and interdimensionality and hyperphysics. And it was actually very articulate. Again, the only thing that kind of dampers it is the religious framework and their demons kind of thing. But it could very well be that, again, somebody in the Collins Elite group was responsible for helping kill that as well as, as OSAP was. But so, UAPs or UFO non-human intelligence, they're already surveilling all our nuclear capabilities. So I don't think it's like haphazard to be like, hey, let's just put it in one spot and see what's going to happen, because it's not like they don't have access to it anyways. We're not giving them any kind of access. Could it provoke them in some way? I don't know. The only one kind of question that comes to mind for me, as I don't want to assign omnipotence to non-human intelligence. Of course, they seem very advanced in many ways, but even if we were baiting them, wouldn't they know what we're up to? That's one question I have about it that I don't understand, and I'd love to ask Lue and others about that myself, because, wouldn't they know that we're just baiting them? But maybe not. Maybe they are just as reactive in certain ways, and that's why something like Interloper is a great idea.
Yeah, I think and it's going to sound silly, but I think I've matured in my perspective of the phenomenon, from my perspective at least. I'm kind of moving away from superstition, if that's a way you could put it. When you kind of got into that, are they really omnipotent? We really don't necessarily know how they think. You would think that it's very plausible that if Project Interloper would have been carried out, that they would have known the intent behind it. I mean, it's easy to assume that, but you're dealing with unknowns, and we don't know the breadth of their awareness. We often assume the breadth of their awareness, but it may not really work that way.
Right, and it depends on, again, it seems when it comes to non-human intelligence and everything that gets wrapped up into UAP, we tend to, not always, and different people have different levels of nuance, but a lot of times we assign this kind of singular intent behind what could be various intelligences. So it could be that I'm just saying these numbers as an example, right? Say there's 4 different visiting non-human intelligence currently that are responsible for the majority of UAP phenomena. Maybe only 1 or 2 of them are the ones that are surveilling our nuclear capabilities, and those are the ones we're going to attract, right? And maybe those ones aren't so advanced psychically, so they can't read our minds and know what we're doing, but they are so advanced technologically that they can technologically eavesdrop on us, and they would seem almost psychic to some, right? Like with the cat point and the Nimitz, for an example. But maybe they're not like truly psychic mind to mind, and they're not advanced in that way if they're some kind of advanced AI, but they would almost seem that way just by how far advanced technologically they were. As an example, again, for argument's sake.
Chris, I'm going to get to you in a second. I just wanted to say that regarding Project Interloper, it makes me think about Roswell, because I know that Lue Elizondo spoke a little bit about Roswell. I don't recall exactly what he said, but he said something to the effect that it was theorized that the reason the UAP crashed was because the Air Force was doing something with their radar, and it interfered with the non-human intelligence technology. If that is true, then they're obviously not omnipotent, because they should have known what was going to happen with whatever the Air Force was utilizing, and they should have avoided that area so that because look what happened, it crashed. Now, I have a tendency, maybe because of my background in studying religion and that influences my psyche, I have a tendency to think that the NHI are basically manipulating us, and they've been doing that since day one, and everything that looks like an accident isn't an accident. I know that's my bias, but as I've matured, I realize that it may actually not be like that. It may be very, very, very different from that. Chris, what do you think about Project Interloper, and what do you think Robert Hastings would have to say about it?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because I think James really touched upon something in terms of looking at it from a military perspective and just kind of like broadening that out. If you're able first to establish within the wider naval apparatus that these things are attracted to nuclear weapons and nuclear fuel by using carriers and submarines and whatnot, actually proving that's disclosure basically to the wider armed services, the people not read into these programs. And secondly, there will inevitably be conversations about potentially bringing these things down, because inevitably you want technology that can track anything and trace anything that is nuclear. Imagine if America had a technology, from these craft that could detect all the Russian subs at any time and have the ability to kind of like potentially even shut them down, like, some of the UFOs have shown to be doing through the Robert Hastings testimony. You would basically be able to just nullify any other nuclear power in the world. Russia's nuclear stockpile would mean nothing. Who gives a rat's ass, if they've got a submarine in the middle of nowhere that they don't think the US can track? Well, the US can track it now, and they can also deactivate their nuclear weapons as well as trace them. So the enormity, the implications of that experiment, if it had gone ahead, really, really, it's crazy. So obviously, you could have some potential scenarios of why it may have happened. So James brought up Collins Elite. Another scenario could be that potentially some treaty had been signed not to bring them down or something like that, and maybe some senior brass knew that maybe inevitability once you attracted them. But I think I would side kind of with the fact that that would be wider disclosure because, outside the CIA and Navy, CIA, Special Forces, CIA, Five Guys, all these partnerships and stuff like that, where only a small number of people who actually read in and know what's going on. The wider kind of like armed services don't have a clue what's going on. And yeah, I would think, and one of my aims with this article is just kind of like widening the awareness of Robert Hastings' work. And I think I think his name will definitely and deservedly go down in history for uncovering the connection of UFOs and nukes. So it's very, very interesting, very, very, very interesting. And I would be willing to bet as well that some very, very senior brass in the Navy have been read into retrievals and reverse engineering, and maybe had something to do with putting a stop to these. And it would also divert your attention as well to the fact that, from my understanding, that someone very, very senior from the US Navy did actually contact and engage with Jake Sullivan following the UFO shoot downs over North America to basically say, look, this stuff's all real. And that was one of the reasons, let's say, why the UAPDA kind of like went ahead in the first place, because you don't just get the president you don't just like bring up legislation with the president's name and the president's involvement with it in terms of appointing a committee in relation to UFO disclosure until you get sign off from the president's team, including Jake Sullivan. So yeah, sorry, that's just kind of like how my brain works there. But it's, yeah, you really, really hit something there in terms of an important topic.
Yeah, and you wrote an article about the OGA, the Office of Global Access, I think, with Josh Boswell. Is that correct? In your research, do you think there is efforts? Because I know that David Grush, he didn't go into it, but he was asked about shoot downs, and I think he said something like there is something to that, but I don't think he really elaborated. In your research, Chris, do you think the U.S. government and potentially other governments have ever been successful in intentionally taking down a UAP, using technologies that they have at their disposal?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that has happened, and I think retrievals currently happen, and there's all sorts of partnerships that the CIA and other intelligence services have. Which go all the way from undersea retrievals to retrievals in joint operations situations with other Five Eyes allies. As we reported on, a partnership as well in terms of gaining access to the craft in places which are not so friendly. And also I would say as well that also goes to space as well. I think there may be retrievals in space, bringing stuff down which isn't Earth's orbit perhaps as well. I think that is a potentiality. I'm not saying it's happened, but I think it's a good potentiality perhaps, which also is why it's very, very important to kind of like have certain companies that trace space trash and all the satellites and everything moving around Earth, which is something that people should really look into. But yeah, there's all sorts of situations. And I'd also say as well that, these partnerships the CIA has is very, very important. And I would also divert your attention to the fact that, yes, the CIA can't, conduct intelligence operations by itself on US soil. However, it can do it in partnerships. So if the FBI has a Russian spy who's come over to the United States and they want to kind of like surveil him, and they might think about arresting him, they'd work in the CIA in that, so CIA would be working on US soil. And I think the same kind of exemption may be as well in terms of working with the Navy, the Army, and other US services on US soil perhaps, or the territory that you guys have at sea. So I think that's really important. And, this stuff is so compartmentalized as well. And the way they work as well, they make it extremely difficult to track. You keep on flipping between, Title 50 authorities and title, is it Title 10 or Title 20? Is it Title 10, which is the DOD? Title 10, I think it's Title 10 authorities. Sorry, but the different authorities, but yeah, Title 10. So they keep on flipping it, so it's harder to track, basically. So you keep on, so that's just really, really important to take into account. It's so compartmentalized. They've had years to kind of like silo this in certain places which are untraceable. And remember as well, there are certain places in the US government that are not even acknowledged. So when we're investigating this stuff, we may not even be aware that like a certain office even existed, and you just got to think to yourself, what other covert places in the US government which are involved in UFO activity are just not acknowledged. So sorry, I digress again. So apologies for that.
I've had my he's going to pop moment reading Elizondo's book and talking with you two, because the UFO issue is so multifaceted. It's really easy to lose sight of all the different facets. I mean, like, how often do we think about the potential that governments have potentially made deals with non-human intelligence, and they're retrieving craft and not telling the rest of the world? Like, how are people going to handle disclosure? I don't know. But it's kind of mind blowing, and I think we will all have he's going to pop moment, from the Matrix, when Neo was learning about the existence of the Matrix, and he's like, I don't believe it. We're all going to kind of have that experience at some point, and I have it from every now and then myself. James, I wanted to ask you. I'm kind of dumbfounded about the retrieval situation. It's just like all of this just blows my mind. I don't know how to handle it, because it's like, if you listen to David Grush, I mean, I get the impression there has been like 60 retrievals. God, I hope that's not the number. Could you imagine someone in the NSA is going to be like, how did he know it was 60? Gonna have some knocks on my door pretty soon. But like, so many retrievals, I get the impression they happen all the time. They're not that rare. I'm trying to remember his exact quotes, but I mean, he said they go before the 30s, because I know on Rogan he wouldn't say it explicitly, but he gave the impression that the one that happened in Italy wasn't the first one, and it's been ongoing. I know that journalist, I can't think of his name, but he did an article where he said there was at least a dozen recoveries. And then China allegedly has recoveries. Russia allegedly has recoveries. So it's like, how many NHI craft are in like facilities across the world? There could be hundreds of them, right? And when you say that, you have that like, he's going to pop moment. I don't believe it. But my thing, James, is like, who's to say that one day one of these craft are not going to like crash at Disney World? You know what I mean? You're like walking around the Star Wars thing, and all of a sudden a UAP crashes, and there's like everyone's taking footage of it. Like, is that not a plausible scenario?
I mean, I would say that the majority of crafts that come down are intentionally downed. I don't think they're randomly coming down, right? Like Roswell, right? There seems to be something that instigated those crafts coming down. It wasn't just a random thing. So I'm sure there's probably some guidelines of like, hey guys, let's not take them down over New York City, or something to that effect. But getting to David Grush, I mean, there was a case from the 1890s in Texas, right? The Tombstone event, where they allegedly buried an entity in Texas, and that was in the late 1800s. So I still don't know if there are so many crashes allegedly. Are some of them seeded, or are there genuine accidents? I don't know. And I think there's probably a lot of obfuscation intentionally around different crashes. I do think Roswell was genuine. There's just there's like too much there. But there's a number of crashes that are talked about. Another one is the Starfish Prime one that Tom had kept talking about. And, we know Tom had a number of advisors, and we know a lot of them are ultra credible people who would be in the need to know for that kind of thing. And again, that was said to be brought down by an EMP. And when I spoke to Lue in an interview,
where did it go down? Do you know? With the
in the Pacific.
Okay.
So they were doing high altitude nuclear detonations in the Pacific. Project Dominic, Operation Dominic. It was like a series of high altitude nuclear detonations, and allegedly, again, according to Tom,
James, thanks for saying allegedly, because that's a good word to use, because I don't think I used it, and I probably should have. Go on.
Yeah, well, because this is quite a claim, if true, that Tom DeLonge has said that, we were genuinely doing high altitude nuclear detonation tests, but there was a small group among that that we consider it a legacy program for sure, did want to see if that kind of EMP from a detonation would affect UAP, and apparently it did.
So EMPs are really interesting. I think that in the book, Elizondo talked about how, I think it was with the Roswell, he talked about how something they did might have taken down the craft, but the NHI might have learned from that, and that will no longer work. But it gets really complicated, because I was telling someone on Twitter recently that I think all of us, every one of us, is a victim of an echo chamber. And feel free to disagree with me on this. It's just my perspective. The reason all of us are a victim of a UFO echo chamber is because of the cover-up. And I think we all are highly exposed to UFO culture. And there's a lot of biases within UFO culture. One of the great biases is, it comes under the umbrella of optimism bias. We love to assume that the UAP are doing intrusions into nuclear ICBM facilities to send a message that we need to stop playing around with these technologies. And that might be true. But I think, in my opinion, we often are way too confident that that's the case. And I believe there's a psychological reason for that. I think the reason we're way too confident of that is because it's been repeated over and over and over again by very influential UFO gurus and experts and these kind of things. And so you may not notice it, but you start to believe that because so many people we respect are saying that over and over again. I grant you, not everyone buys into that, but in my opinion, that's just optimism bias. We honestly have nowhere near enough data to assume that is the major motivation of why the NHI are doing it. In fact, I would say we can't assume anything. We just don't have enough data. It could be completely selfish. It could just be part of the phenomena that lives on Earth and are monitoring us because they don't want us to destroy the planet. It may not be because they're altruistic. So that gets me to a section of Lue's book, or I'll read it. I'll read the citation, I guess. What makes them tick? What made them tick? He's saying that in regards to the psychology of non-human intelligence. I could see only 3 scenarios. The visitors are benevolent and don't want to interfere with our existence. They just want to continue using Earth as a galactic waste station for natural resources. Or possibly they are so benevolent that they hope to save us from ourselves. They're malevolent. They are here to take from us and will show up in vast numbers in the future. They're neutral. Like humans, they can do both good and bad, and they hope to observe and learn from us. So I'll bring this to you, Chris. One of the things Elizondo said in the book is that it's okay to be optimistic. That was my impression. It's okay to hope that they're here for a good purpose, but it's irresponsible to assume that they don't have any nefarious objectives. And one of the metaphors Lue uses, which I think is a really good metaphor, it's like you're non-human intelligence and you're watching these beautiful, you're watching humans and you think they're beautiful, just like a biologist might think silverback gorilla is a really beautiful creature, and you're studying them and you're learning them, and they're wonderful creatures. But one day the silverback gorilla learns how to escape from their cage, and goes into the office of the biology unit and gets a tranquilizer gun or whatever. And then one day it gets a shotgun and ends up on the driveway of one of the biologists. I'm really messing up his metaphor, by the way, but you get the point. The metaphor is this: the non-human intelligence may be fascinated us, think we're beautiful creatures. But what happens when what you're studying starts to slowly but surely get on your level? And now, since the nuclear age, we may be on the precipice of creating our own UFOs. And since we're humans and we're very warlike and we have war written into our DNA, now the non-human intelligence might be like, now the humans are starting to present a threat to us, the non-human intelligence. So my question for you, Chris, is Lue Elizondo being irresponsible by saying that we should be prepared for the worst? Should we instead, for example, just take what Stephen Greer says as gospel and assume that non-human intelligence would never pose any problems for us? And further, what could we do to prepare for the worst? What exactly would that even look like?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that situation, that supposes that, because I do believe there are multiple intelligences. That's just something I believe, can't back it up. But I think that, that supposes that at least one form of non-human intelligence, and that form is the one they want to talk about and focus on the most, could potentially have plans for us. And, you could use another analogy of how we might view it. It's maybe you'll recognize this from Secret Machines. You have a bunch. You have a mice problem or something like that. So you get a bunch of dogs, basically. Nothing too violent or terrifying, but they do the job. They get rid of the mice. You don't have the problem anymore. And you've got good use for them. But then all of a sudden, when they're no longer of any use to you, you basically get a gun and you shoot them. Well, you don't need them anymore. So maybe you want to transform that dog that's not very threatening into a bloodhound, so that when the owner comes back to shoot them, you can actually do something about it. So perhaps part of the cover-up could be the fact that a large aspect of this in terms of defense that we have has been covered up in terms of advanced technology that we've learned through reverse engineering and whatnot. And I would also say as well that if that is the situation, then it could tally up with some of the accounts that we've heard that, the Russians and the Americans were working together during the Cold War on this topic. And you look at, I think it was Jonathan Wagent, US Air Force. I think he might have been a Marine, who seemed to have stumbled upon an alleged kind of UFO crash in South America, where he said basically there were people from different nations, including Chinese and Germans at this site, all working together. That would suppose that there is some kind of like international coordination behind this cover-up, and that there is an effort to basically not give our hand away, not just because we want to keep it secret for selfish purposes, but because there is potentially preparation to defend ourselves, and we don't want to give our hand by showing what we really have in terms of weapons and technology to this non-human intelligence. And if that is true, you have to ask yourself questions. Has NASA tracked anything, for example, potentially coming to this Earth that, quite quickly, that it could be potentially covering up from the public? So you ask yourself questions like that. Obviously, this is just how my mind works. Don't take this to the bank as true, but this is just speculation on my part in terms of what it could be about.
James, I'd like to get your take. Do you think it's irresponsible for Lue Elizondo to talk about preparing for the worst? because he's really, if you read the book, he's really adamant about that being part of the equation. Of course, if you were to speak to someone like Stephen Greer would be like, there's no need to prepare for the worst. They are not a threat. They never will be a threat. And they're either neutral or they're benevolent, but there's nothing, I hope I'm not putting words in Greer's mouth, but I would assume that he would say there's nothing they will do to harm humanity. But of course, we know from UFO history that at least unintentionally they have harmed humanity. One example would be the Arizona. I can't remember his name offhand. And also John Burroughs from the Rendlesham Forest. He got injured from the alleged craft that landed at the nuclear storage site. So, what do you think, James? Do you think it's irresponsible for Lue Elizondo to be adamant about the need to prepare for the worst? And what do you think preparing for the worst would look like?
Yeah, I mean, coming from somebody, I've had positive encounters, right? So I generally have an optimistic view to some degree, right? I mean, over the years, I've definitely taken a step back and said, it's possible that whole scenario, the positive aspect was designed, right, for me to respond a certain way and whatever. I don't really think that's the case, right? But ultimately, the question of does the UFO phenomenon present a threat? There's no escaping that conversation, right? That undeniably we have to address that, right? Basically, in a very basic sense. It's going to be one of the first questions that everybody asks. So instead of ignoring it, like maybe Stephen Greer would suggest that they're not a threat, you have to address it. So, if they're really not a threat, I don't think there's in any scenario that by asking that question we're somehow threatening non-human intelligence, right? I don't, people sometimes, and I understand where they're coming from, but they sympathize with the UFO phenomenon to a degree where that somehow to even question their intentions is an offense, where I don't see that as the case. If they wanted to present themselves as a non-threat, they can do it immediately at any time, right? So I don't think there's any scenario where we as humans are victimizing the poor UFO phenomenon. No, they're like way advanced, and if they're so benevolent, they should expect that kind of response from us and respect our exploration of humanity to work through that as a civilization. So they should expect that if they're benevolent non-human intelligence, they should totally give us our space to navigate that question. And preparing for the worst, I mean, what that would look like is, I mean, I didn't read the books or see the film, but that's like kind of like the three body problem kind of story, right? I haven't seen it. I know the synopsis basically, but I don't think it would be a good thing. I mean, I've heard in some way that the way that Tom DeLonge talks about, the UFO phenomenon, and that we've developed weapons and that we can fight back now. At the same time, I think, wow, I don't know about that, right? Like, if they're really that advanced, to think that we're coming closer to their level, I don't think so. We may have a few technologies and tricks, but if that truly is the case, where the non-human intelligence is malevolent and this whole thing, like we're basically screwed, more or less. And this whole thing is just going through the motions thing. But I don't think that is the case. Yeah. I just like Christopher, I think that there's probably different groups. maybe some with not maybe our interest in mind, but that are looking out for us and won't let another group interfere with us too much. But again, that's complete speculation. I don't know. And that gets down to the conversation of agreements as well. What were the agreements? What are the agreements? What happens if is disclosure, not disclosing one of the agreements, and what's going to happen if we do? If there is a group that we have agreements with, what is going to happen if we overstep whatever the agreement is? But overall, in what Lue was talking about, and again, with him coming out with this book, I think is in part to make this a public conversation, right? Because as much as I'd like to have the answer for you, Ryan and Christopher, and as much as we like to maybe give some people insight, it's going to take more than us three and Lue Elizondo to figure this out. It's going to take everybody. We need all the academics asking these questions, right? The theologians and military strategists, right?
And don't you think that would help us to get out of the UFO culture echo chamber?
Yeah, I mean, we have to. I mean, because
I think a lot of people on Twitter, I think they're, and I'm not trying to insult them, because I think I fall into the same trap. But we listen to our emotions, and we make these assumptions about the phenomenon, and it feels so right. But what feels so right doesn't necessarily mean that's what the truth is. And I think part of the reason we get into this trap is because we haven't had academia or other world governments discussing this with us. So we get into this false sense of expertise that I think is fostered by the very fact that not enough of our institutions have chimed in on this issue.
Yeah, and again, and I think part of the mission of Lue's book is to get this conversation on a serious level. Absolutely,
and I will say this, I'm trying very hard not to moralize people's opinions of whether it's malevolent or neutral, mixed, benevolent. I'm trying very hard not to moralize it, because I think that's one of the issues that I see in the UFO community that I take issue with. We should not moralize people's opinions. This is not a religion. This is a mystery of the highest order. And once we start moralizing how people perceive the phenomenon, we're basically dismissing their perspective. And I'm not suggesting that we can't disagree. We should disagree. I'm not suggesting that we can't debate. We should debate. But when we start belittling or dismissing people's perspective because we're so sure we're correct about the situation, that's when I think we start falling into a trap. And I think that's a byproduct of what I call UFO culture echo chamber that we're all have been part of, because the situation is so artificial. It's not natural for the biggest subject in the world to be fringe. That is completely artificial, and it breeds all kinds of problems. One of those problems, in my opinion, is people assuming with too much confidence that the reason UFOs do intrusions into nuclear facilities is to send a message to us: don't play with matches, your world is beautiful. Maybe that's the case, but equally plausible, maybe that's not the case. And I'm not saying people can't have an opinion and have an opinion on what's most likely and what's not most likely, but when they start suggesting that their perspective is factually most likely, that's when we run into problems, because there's no way in the world they can say that objectively it's most likely that the reason UAP are doing intrusions into nuclear facilities is because they're trying to send a message to us to get rid of these things. There's no way we can do that. But us in this community have a tendency to do that, I think, in large part because we have the UFO culture echo chamber, and we haven't been exposed enough to other people's opinions. It's always people that have been involved in this topic for years and years and years. I want to hear from the CIA. I want to hear from the NSA. I want to hear from Christianity. I want to hear from other religions. I want to hear from atheists. I want to hear from biologists and sociologists. And we're not going to ever do that until this subject leaves the fringe. And I guess maybe that's one of the reasons it's so silly when people say, silly to me, and I'm not trying to disparage their perspective, but it's silly to me when people say we can just bypass everything. Okay, we can bypass everything, but then we're going to be in our UFO culture echo chamber, and that is going to make us have very strong beliefs that I don't think are necessarily justified. But then again, I'm just ranting because that's what I do. Let's see. Here's an interesting one, and I'll go to Chris on this one, and then I'll get back to James. This is a really interesting one that I like a lot. Let's go to orbs. In the book, Lue Elizondo talked about seeing green orbs a lot. I don't remember, I think it was for the entire duration he was an ATIP. He saw green orbs. His daughters saw green orbs. His wife saw green orbs. His neighbors saw green orbs. And that's why I believe there's a high likelihood they were actually seeing green orbs. I can't say what they were, but the idea that they were all LARPing or part of all part of a mass hallucination between all these different people, I personally don't buy it, but maybe I'm wrong. But here's to me what that elicits or what that drives home. When you engage the phenomenon engages back, right? We could take that away from Lue Elizondo's experience. And Lue Elizondo is like, what are these green orbs doing? Are they surveilling me and my family because I'm looking into them? And so, Chris, is it a risk to have disclosure? Because what happens when we have disclosure? All 8 billion human brains are going to start engaging the phenomenon in a way that's unprecedented. And maybe part of the engagement of the phenomenon is just reading more about it. Or maybe there'll be a big part of the population that starts, doing CE5. And it does seem that UFO history teaches us that the phenomenon is reactive. It is not completely independent in its operations. We do one thing, it seems to respond, right? That seems to be a theme that is very common within UFO history. So what would you say, Chris, to the idea that we should not disclose? Because if we disclose, that's going to open a door for the phenomenon to start engaging us in a much more proactive and unambiguous way. Do we want to all, wake up at 3 a.m. and see green orbs in our bedroom like Lue Elizondo and his family experience? What would you say to that, Chris?
I just think that's really, really interesting because, a number of sources have told me previously that UAP phenomena represents something like a control system, something that Jacques Vallée has previously touched upon. And I think that's really, really interesting. And there is this fascination as well by, people who do know a lot about this topic from the government, who do seem to have an interest in religion, Christianity, and, an interesting one being Islam as well. I remember watching the Jim Semivan interview with you, James, and he likened the phenomena to jinn, the jinn, which is something that Muslims believe in. And after that interview, I actually spoke to one of my Muslim friends on the jinn, and it is something in that religion which is taken highly seriously, and they see it as a reality. Basically, it's not just like I believe it is reality. So much so that her family in Bangladesh, they're always warned that you have to go in before dark. Don't use flashlights or anything like that, so don't engage. And it's taken deadly seriously, basically, within that religion. Do not mess with these things. Do not put your flashlights out. In no way engage with these things. Otherwise, they will come to you and they are bad news. So I always found that really, really interesting. Has there been, a control system in place, maybe for good or for worse? And in terms of humanity, are we getting to a place now in science and technology where those control systems are falling apart, with the advent of nuclear technology and the scientific method and other things, atheism. So perhaps that's a big part of the puzzle as well. So that's just my thoughts in terms of that topic.
Before I get to you, James, I just want to share. I've shared this before, but I don't think it was widely circulated. I did 2 videos on near-death experiences. After I stopped filming the second one. I'd have to go back. I talked about it in the second. I think I talked about it in the second video. But after I uploaded it, it was real late at night, and I went to bed. I kid you not, I felt an overwhelming presence. Now, I'm not saying that I mean, obviously, feeling a presence is not unambiguous like seeing an orb or an apparition. But I can say that this presence that I felt was so overwhelming, I was not willing to go to sleep. Like, I just had this incredible sense that there was something in the room with me that wanted me to know it was in the room with me. And I've never experienced anything like that before. And like, if you were to ask me, like, from a 1 to 10, how overwhelming was it? I would say it was an 11. It was ridiculous. And it happened right, as I remember, it happened right after either I finished the video or I uploaded the video to YouTube. It was real late at night. And apparently, I'm not the only one who's experienced something like that. I know that Robert Bigelow, and I've been trying to track down this interview. I think it was when he was talking to Mishlove from New Thinking Aloud. I'm going to have to review that interview again. But Robert Bigelow was talking about how some of his team from BICS, Consciousness Studies, I don't remember what the whole acronym is, but Robert Bigelow was talking about how some of the people working with him, his team members studying consciousness, they would have all kinds of weird experiences that seemed to be associated with them studying consciousness, kind of like some form of the hitchhiker effect, if you will. And so between Lue Elizondo's experience with the green orbs, my experience doing 2 videos on near-death experiences, and then after the second one, feeling this bizarre presence that was so overwhelming. I'm not saying that it was anomalous. It might have just been my brain playing tricks on me. I'm just saying that it was overwhelming. There does seem to be something to engaging these concepts or alleged phenomena that maybe opens the door for them to start coming into our world. So, James, are we irresponsible for pushing for disclosure? Maybe we should never disclose. Maybe the moment we disclose and all 8 billion people start looking into these anomalous realities, that the veil, if you will start to thin, and now we'll have, hundreds of millions of people having anomalous experiences that they never otherwise would have. Are we being irresponsible by pushing for UFO transparency within this context?
I mean, if you ask me, no. I mean, I think it's an inevitability, but you're probably asking the wrong person. I've engaged the phenomenon, right, intentionally after having a number of experiences. My experiences happen to be positive, right, if I can use that word. And there's a lot of such cases that are reported. I mean, not everybody has an outcome like that, but generally speaking, let's just say within CE5, the majority of people that go out intending to have an experience overwhelmingly have positive experiences, right? Not to say that there have never been negative experiences, because there may be like literally probably 1% of the, I've worked with hundreds of people in the field, and then many thousands, non-locally through the internet and in that kind of contact modalities work. And generally speaking, the phenomenon is very reflective, right? And I spoke a little bit with this on the last talk I did with Jeffrey Kripal, but there's been a lot of thinkers over time who have discussed that kind of reflective nature of the phenomenon. It seems to be able to see, it makes you see things as you see things in some ways. But this concern about disclosure and it opening some kind of floodgate for the UFO phenomenon to come into our world and touch our world is a concern of the Collins elite. Right. And funny enough, Tom DeLonge made a quote about this in a magazine maybe 2 months ago when he was talking about his new book, War. that, I found Tom's idea very interesting in that he said, well, for some whatever reason, the phenomenon can't impinge upon our free will directly, but if it tricks us into using our free will to invite them in, then we're in trouble, kind of thing, right? And I found this idea interesting. My own take is that they're already here. They've been doing what they're doing, and I think the more transparency we have on it, the more information we have on it, the more informed we can make decisions based on that. So it's inevitable that we're going to come to the crossroads of, should we disclose what is the ultimate reality of the UFO phenomenon? So, maybe I'm just impatient because I'm a New Yorker, but let's get with the program already. For better or worse, I'm not into delaying the inevitable.
Absolutely. Jake, can I just touch upon it as well? Because
go for it.
I mean, I think you might enjoy this, right? As well. I mean, in terms of kind of like what does the UFO phenomenon represent? What does life represent? What does humanity represent? What is the universe? We still don't know these things, and Lue always talk about the fact that we can only see things through our senses, and about, the animal kingdom and all these other kingdoms that we didn't know before, as technology's got better and stuff like that. And I mean, the fact is that we still know very little about reality, especially when it comes to the quantum world. So, I mean, maybe when we're asking these questions about, what the agenda is for some of these intelligences, until we can better understand ourselves and the reality of the universe and who we really, really are, maybe we don't know, those answers yet, because we're not aware of them. We're not aware of the reality. So, yeah, that's kind of what I think when it comes down to that. And, this is why the study of consciousness is so important. This is why looking at topics such as life and after death is so important as well, especially when you hear some of the accounts of people floating over the tables and they seem to be aware of conversations that are happening in other rooms. I just think that's so interesting. So, you have to think to yourself, if a species has advanced so far, then, can they read our minds? Can they influence us? Our reality, if someone once, I think it was Robert Lanza, who's, someone who came up with the concept of biocentrism within quantum mechanics. He said that, being, I think he's a geneticist, he was saying that all he has to do is do an alteration to your brain. Then all of a sudden, every time you see the color blue, you're actually seeing the color pink. So it's just so easy, even now with the technology that we've gotten and the understanding we have now, to just alter someone's consciousness and how they perceive things. Then you get into the conversation, like I said before, if you have an advanced species which are thousands of years more advanced, it's quite frightening just to kind of like think about how they can control your perception to a certain extent.
I want to push back against the Collins elite a little bit. And in fairness to the Collins elite, the Collins elite is a symptom of, I think, very fundamentalism in any religion. And yes, even spiritual philosophies can also be fundamentalist. It's not something exclusive to some of our great organized religions. My pushback to this mentality is that I think it's wrong. I think it's a response. It's a response to what we don't understand, and it's a lazy response to what we don't understand. For example, if the universe is truly one, we all emanate from a first being. That means everything in the universe is ultimately God, from the chair to this grain of sand, to a cloud, Even the heart of a serial murderer is a piece of the divine. And when we engage the world, we use part of the construct. We use what's within our disposal. So if someone were to ask me for advice, like, "Oh, I'm looking for a job. What should I put on my resume?" I might tell them what to do. And so they would be utilizing the construct of God. But what some fundamentalists do in religion, in my opinion, is they make a false artificial demarcation that I do not buy. So if there is any truth to something like positive causative thinking, the idea that if we have a deep enough resonance with our belief, that could stack the cards in our favor of a desired outcome coming to pass, they may look at that as idolatry or going off the path or something like that, because that's what their forefathers said, and that's what their religious doctrine says. But I would challenge that. I would say, if there's any truth to causative thinking, God put that into the matrix, and you can either use it or not. And in that light, within Lue Elizondo's book, I never know how to pronounce it, but the Cade Pudime, James, could you pronounce it for me?
In all my talks with Gary, he's called it the Cade Pudime.
Okay.
Him and Ross pronounce it a little differently, but Cade Putamen. So
the Cade Putamen is a part of the brain that, according to some research that's been done with Dr. Gary Nolan, is that people who have a very developed Cade Putamen are more psychic, and they may be more prone to seeing UFOs and other anomalous things. So if we were to take the Collins elite's perspective to its logical conclusion, we would say that people with a particularly developed Cade Putamen are inherently more satanic, right? It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
That God made those people like that. And God made some people really good at remote viewing, and other people may not be as good at it, right? These are talents. These are God-given talents as far as I'm concerned. And I would not be surprised at all that this is where humanity is going. Humanity is going in the direction of developing these capabilities. That is the divine plan from the creator of the heavens and the earth. I think that's very plausible. And just because the Collins elite or other fundamentalists would tell me, no, you got that wrong. You see, when you start practicing these things, now you're opening yourself up to Satan and idolatry and polytheism and all this. I would say, that's your opinion. Why does God create some people to have more talent in these areas than others? Is that like a temptation? Like the temptation to cheat on your spouse that they have to turn off? It just doesn't make any sense. And so, if there are deeper aspects of our human reality that we can tap into, whether it's healing ourselves of disease or influencing future things that could happen, or having precognitive dreams, and we could use those for godly purposes, then how in the world are you going to tell me that, no, you can't use them for godly purposes? They're too dangerous. They're too risky. It just doesn't make any sense. I find that it almost insults my intelligence. And look, one thing I'm famous for is I'm always open to being persuaded that I'm wrong. So if someone can give me an argument to explain to me why these capacities, these alleged capacities, are dangerous and should not be pursued, persuade me, and maybe I'll agree with you. But as it stands now, I just see this as deeper potentials that human beings have. And maybe non-human intelligences have these deeper potentials more realized and more at their disposal. So maybe disclosure would lead to us developing these capacities in a more advanced way. Why would that be bad? Why would that be bad? To me, that would just be us tapping into something that's already there, that was created by God. And I take great issue with the idea that if human beings do have more potential than we've been led to believe, then the answer is not putting these potentials in the light of good or bad. The answer is asking ourselves, how can we use these to improve the quality of life in our world? So that's what I would say. James, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, it's when within their own literature, we have saints, right, in these different religions, and it's in the scriptures, right? People levitating. I mean, it's literally just a shift in framework, because even the Immaculate Conception, right? If you're to take that as a reality, what's to say that wasn't actually a demon that did that to Mary, and that rather than an angel? It's literally a shift in perspective and nothing more.
That's a great point. Yeah, and I like that you bring up the saints. Unfortunately, I have not read any books on that. I plan to. I have trouble reading, but there have been books written about saints tapping into capabilities, and this is what I would argue: these mystical capabilities are universal. It doesn't matter what spiritual pathway, what religion you look at. There are stories of people from all spiritual paths and religious backgrounds that have developed these capacities. And I would argue the reason that Catholics have done it, Christians have done it, Muslims have done it, Jews have done it, Buddhists have done it, atheists have done it, spiritualists have done it, Sufis have done it, allegedly, is because they have developed themselves through their own philosophies to tap into these capabilities, and the subtle differences in their scriptures is not going to prevent them from tapping into that intrinsic possibility that all human beings have potentially to various degrees. So it's kind of strange to say, well, this person did it from this spiritual pathway, so therefore it is of God. But this person of another religion or another spiritual background, they also tapped into these anomalous capacities, but because they did it through a different philosophy, therefore it's from Satan. That is absolutely absurd to me. I think the much more probable answer as to why people from different traditions have allegedly tapped into these capabilities is simply because they are intrinsic to the human being. And so whether you're a Buddhist who meditates 10 hours a day, or you're somebody else who engages in prayer 10 hours a day, something might be developed through those practices that allows us to tap into something that's already there. And it doesn't mean that because you do it in this spiritual tradition that it's righteous and it's of God, but if you do it in this spiritual tradition, now it's of Satan. That is absurd. And I'm going to push back against that because it makes no sense. Christopher, you have anything to add about this?
No, I think really it kind of reminds me in a way as well about Gnosticism and the beliefs on that, in terms of humans kind of like being a product of demiurge and archons and whatnot, but also humanity and humans having a touch of the divine in them as well. And there being kind of an agenda of archons, as the Collins elite might know them as, kind of like trying to stop us from understanding our full potential. So that's kind of like my thoughts when it comes to that. And it's something that I obviously don't have much expertise in, but I do obviously take an interest in it as well. So and I do want to learn more about it too.
Yeah, and my theory as to why people from all these different traditions, a lot of them, the saints of different traditions, if you want to call them saints, have developed these capacities is because they've developed self-mastery in their own way. Whether it's the Buddhist meditating for 10 hours, or it's someone from the Jewish, Christian, or Muslim tradition who's developed self-mastery in terms of controlling their thoughts and their emotions and their actions and their own specific meditation practices, it seems to me that when you embark in these practices where you potentially connect more deeply with your psyche and your spirit because you go through these motions, it's that gives these people access to these capabilities. It's not that they're so the idea that if someone does it from one tradition, it's of God, but if they do it from another tradition, it's not from God. I just think that's silly. James, why do you think that in the near-death experience literature, a lot of times, I don't know how often, I'm not an expert in NDEs, but there are stories that when people have a near-death experience, when they come back from that experience, They're sometimes more psychic. They may start having precognitive dreams or other capacities that prior to that experience was completely oblivious from their experience. Why do you think that might be?
Well, before I address that, I just want to say, even if people are displaying some of these capabilities, maybe that makes them more human.
I like that. I like that.
But this same kind of effect that you're talking about was also addressed by Jacques Vallée in regarding UFO events. And in the Invisible College book, he had explained about this guy called Dr. X, and he had this transformation. And again, we have a very controversial character, I know, but Uri Geller, right? He discloses in his book that he had a UFO event in his yard when he was a child, right? And after that opened up these possibilities. And again, near-death experiences as well, because I think, I just have to say, I think when you are broken out of your consensus reality, it just opens you up, right? That's the only way I can describe it. And I think the people kind of closest to this state of being are like children, right? Like if they don't know their own limits, you break out of your conditioning. And again, this could also happen if you're just somebody who stumbles upon deep meditation, spirituality. There's generally a period of people, even with a near-death experience, of ontological shock, right? And this is why I love the UFO phenomenon in some ways, because it's like a physical object or event or reality that it's apparent, right? It's not just something entirely subjective, even though there's a subjective component to it, but that it also has the same quality of transformation. And I just think that has to do with the filters that we kind of place on ourselves, right? And a lot of that is cultural. It's traditional. It's through your family, your social groups, and when I made like a little scale, and I think of it like this: like if you are somebody, we all have these filters, right? It's our survival mechanism, right? It helps us to survive and adapt on a daily basis, including social pressures, because we're social animals. But when you have a UFO encounter, depending on how extreme it is, right? But let's say it's an extreme one, right? I'll say it has 100% chance of altering your of breaking that kind of conditioning, right? Of undoing some of those filters. It has 100% chance. When you have something like a near-death experience, I think it has something like 1,000% chance of blowing those filters to hell. And you're perceiving reality in an almost unfiltered condition, and that in some sense there's no going back from that.
But it's almost like on a biological level, the filter has diminished after the near-death experience.
Well, I mean, this is so I'm sure you guys have heard of epigenetics. So your consciousness literally affects your biology. This is what's so fascinating. This is why the placebo effect works. The fact that it works at all is telling you that your thought affects your immune system and what have you. So it's I think it's a back and forth, right? It's kind of both. So I think if you change the way you think, like especially in an extreme way, it's going to alter your biology. That's epigenetics, and that's become more apparent in the last few years of research. But 30 years ago, that was like a crazy idea that you can think and it somehow can alter your biology in some way. But now we know that's true. So I think it has to do with those filters. I don't know if you can truly ever undo them. It's the same I'm not encouraging this, obviously, but if somebody has like a psychedelic thing where it breaks, maybe not to the same level of a near-death experience or a UFO encounter, but to some extent it undoes some of those filters, and they can, and the same thing can happen if somebody goes on a 10-day Vipassana retreat, right? For whatever reason, you hit whatever level of awakening from that retreat of self-knowledge, know thyself kind of thing. And you have a realization about reality, and some of these filters that you are self-induced dissipate. And because of that, you're perceiving reality in a different way, and that's going to ultimately affect you on every level.
Chris, I have a question for you. What do you make of Colares? The 1970s, a bunch of different areas in Brazil. Colares was the epicenter, but it happened all over Brazil. People were getting injured, and some, I think, even died. People were, all this allegedly, let me preface that, people were allegedly getting abducted as well. How do we factor that into our perception of non-human intelligence?
Again, I mean, this goes to the theory that there are, the allegation that there are different entities of these things with different agendas. And don't forget as well, like, if people are speaking about different species, let's say one of them is like the Greys or something like that, what makes people think that they all have the same agenda and that they're united, and that they're all the same, So, I mean, that runs through my mind. In terms of Colares, I think George Knapp may have gone there recently to explore it. It's a really, really interesting case. And I mean, when it comes to South American cases, it's, they have a different kind of relationship with the phenomenon than we do in the West. It seems much more of a reality that they kind of accept. And, South America is a very, very interesting place, I guess. There's lots of mysticism around the place. There's lots of, alleged kind of like activity of UAP, and also, going into that as well, you have to think, what happened after World War II? Well, you had a lot of very, very high-ranking kind of like senior Nazi scientists go over there and work with a bunch of governments on their military programs. And, you can't help but think, is there potential presence of kind of like the phenomenon in South America due to the things that the Nazis were kind of creating and continue to create and work on in South America for the governments. Many of the governments are, including the Argentinian government and the government of Chile. And I think as well, perhaps Brazil is in there too. So I don't know. It's a really, really interesting case study in terms of what's happening in Brazil. Ronnie Vedette, who is our guy in Brazil. He's doing fantastic work, and may it continue. And but I guess when it comes to this, you still think that even if the Brazilian government and the Argentines and others are on board, it still seems to me that it's the US that has the keys to kind of like opening this up and kind of like providing some of the answers that we're looking for.
James, I know you have talked about something that Jacques Vallée said regarding Colares. Two-part question for you, James. Number one, how do we factor in what allegedly took place in Colares? And I say allegedly, but it seems very likely that it did. It's so well documented. And number two, do you think it's possible that that was not non-human intelligence and that all of the incidents that happened in Colares were simply the result of some government operation?
This is exactly why we need UAP transparency. Because this is such a mystery. Jacques Vallée in Forbidden Science Volume 4 wrote that he has secured a document that confirms that the CIA was conducting psychological operations in South America to stage UFO abductions. Jacques Vallée is not one to say something like that lately, and he made a similar comment, and I meshed them together in like a short little video that I have on my YouTube channel and on Twitter. And he didn't mention Colares specifically, but he mentioned Brazil and Argentina, so he's very specific in that. And in a talk with Jeffrey Mishlove, I think that the talk was from the 70s or the 80s. It's really old, and because Jeffrey Mishlove has been at this forever. On New Thinking, or this is when it was called Thinking Aloud. Before it was New Thinking Aloud. He asked Jacques about UAP events, and Jacques says that in that video, that interview with Jeffrey Mishlove, that some, him and other scientists, so it wasn't just his biased kind of conclusion, him and some other scientists, and we can assume who some of them are, came to the conclusion that in some UFO events, it seems that there's a sophisticated group that's behind hoaxing them, not on the part of the person experiencing them, but by some kind of sophisticated group that would have the resources and capability to stage a UFO event. And I don't want to go too much on a tangent on this, but when the term MyLab comes up, we have this idea that there's a fake UFO involved, and there's some kind of UFO occupant. There's like a little gray occupant that's controlled by the military, and this whole thing's fake. When for a MyLab to occur, one simple level, all it needs to be is that you convince somebody that they had a UFO event. A silent helicopter with some weird lights on it, and hey, let's use some kind of hypnosis to make the person believe, or let's even drug them. Right? You can drug them and tell them they saw something, and when they come to, they believe they had whatever experience you induced, and that's all you would really need. Not to say that there aren't more sophisticated capabilities, because there most certainly are. Slide 9 of the ATIP slides is talking about all these things. It's talking about the capabilities of non-human intelligence being able to influence our consciousness. But there's like some small writing there. It says that the DoD has these capabilities and has been experimenting with these capabilities as well. Yeah. So I do think that there are cases where UFOs and non-human intelligence have been used as a ploy to experiment with experimental technologies, non-lethal technologies. I even put together a video I think everybody should watch called Targeted Individuals. And just one interesting note on that is that even in that video, there was a clip somewhere of John Alexander saying that he used NLP and hypnosis to make somebody believe that they had a true UFO abduction. That's a MyLab, right? And he said it himself. So there's nothing kind of weird or negative about me saying it. He said it, not me. So he disclosed that to some podcaster that I think that had nothing to do with UFOs, but he slipped that in there, and it's on the record. But Colares as a whole, again, there's one researcher pointed out that, in one instance that there was a net involved. I don't think non-human intelligence are capturing people in nets. So there's something funny there. There's something more that meets the eye to those cases. There were physical effects. And again, if we had UFO transparency or UAP transparency, we wouldn't have this confusion. And if, another kind of issue that comes up with that is like, if you want people to stop blaming the government and, for UFO conspiracies and stuff, just tell us the truth then, because then we won't have to be suspicious of them as much, right? We have this confusion because there's been a cover-up. right? And it's going to inherently, spawn all these conspiracies and distrust and everything else. And I'm not even going to go into the collateral damage of people we've lost and people that have been negatively affected by the cover-up. But just to be back on Colares, it could have been that there was genuine activity going on and that somebody saw the opportunity in that to see if they can perpetuate their own covert operation and see if it would hold up to the other interactions that were going on.
I love that nuance. Instead of just assuming that it's all government activity, it could be much more nuanced. It could be that something bizarre was going on with non-human intelligence terrorizing the people of that area. But some organization said, okay, the NHI is acting up. We have no idea. This is the perfect opportunity to test out our own capabilities along with what the NHI is doing. And I think that's a really important take because, again, we are so conditioned by UFO culture echo chamber that we don't think in these nuanced ways. We just love feeling like it must be one way and we go with it. And I see that constantly. We see that with how some people demonize the U.S. government like it's a monolith. Lue Elizondo must be a disinformation agent. David Grush must be a disinformation agent. UFO culture echo chamber. Yay, I feel so good. I'm fighting the government. No, it may be much more complicated and much more nuanced. Stop the UFO culture echo chamber. Just because you feel into the deepest recess of your soul that this is the way it is, doesn't mean that's necessarily the way it is. Our emotions often deceive us, even when they feel completely sincere. James, you wanted to add to that?
I just wanted to say also that I don't want to say, hey, I know that the CIA and some covert U.S. group was doing this. Again, Christopher Sharp over here, he brought up like a Nazi group, right? And there's a lot of talk about that in Secret Machines that there is a breakaway group, right? And so we can only imagine what that breakaway group is that could conduct such a kind of operation. It doesn't have to be a UFO legacy program that's going around doing these things. It could be some kind of breakaway group as well. And the legacy programs are at a difference with them or trying to tell the difference between them as well. So I mean, I don't want to. I'm just for nuance sake, and again, just for conversational sake.
Love it. Or I'll add. Yeah, go ahead.
This is a reality, but it could be the UFO legacy group are the good guys, and they're trying to, they're at odds with this breakaway group.
Yeah, and to bring more nuance to the discussion, I'll say that I'm personally skeptical of my labs, but you know what? One of the things I said early in this video is, I don't want to police people's opinions. So I can be skeptical of something or disagree with someone, but I'm not going to dismiss their perspective because maybe they're right. But if my labs exist on the level of, a U.S. government's flying saucer or whatever, if they exist, and I don't know if they do, I personally doubt it, but I don't know that for sure. Maybe I'm wrong in my skepticism, but if they exist, we don't know that it's the U.S. government that's doing it.
Right.
If non-human intelligence could have picked out like some group of scientists that have no affiliation with the U.S. government or U.S. military, and they've been around for a long time, they're the ones doing the MyLabs, and it has nothing to do with the U.S. government or the CIA or the NSA or the Navy or the Air Force. Like people really, we need to be more nuanced and get out of that UFO culture echo chamber that I think is just so pervasive. And a lot of times we think like we really emotionally feel like, oh, I got it figured out, X is Y, Z, but maybe it's a lot more nuanced, or maybe it's something very different than what we emotionally feel. I don't want to keep you two any longer, and I really appreciate you being here. So I'm going to give you both one more thing to say. Chris, I'll go with you first. Chris, whatever you want to talk about, you can go as long as you want. You can cover whatever you want, and you can also plug yourself when you're done. Go ahead.
No, I just want to thank you both. It's just been like, I'm a participant of this conversation, but I've just loved as well the debate and just listening to you guys, and it's just fantastic. Just adding on the Colares stuff. We know for a fact that the US was interested in kind of human experiments, psychological torture, drugs, to basically influence people, get confessions and whatnot. So we know that was already an interest of the CIA from MK Ultra. So, what's to stop us from thinking that the CIA went much further than that, but it just wasn't uncovered in terms of that aspect of it. So, yeah, I think it's definitely plausible that it could have been something like that. And, like you said before, the US government isn't a monolithic kind of thing. It's, I think Lue Elizondo referred to it as fiefdoms, basically. And CIA is part of that. And I think there are rogue elements within the CIA, definitely. And as well, just touching upon what James said as well, yes, I think that is really, really interesting. It may not just be like nation states, let's say, state actors that have potential legacy programs and UAP programs. There may be a breakaway group. And that might be the real danger in terms of trying to hush this subject up and behind threats and whatnot. So definitely keep that in mind. And going back to the CIA again, it really is ridiculous the amount of power they may have in terms of behind the scenes. Look at the Wikipedia scandal that's been uncovered by Rob Heatherly, for example, and look at the former co-founder of Wikipedia basically saying CIA has just kind of like gained control of Wikipedia. They've managed to game it so well that they kind of like have major influences on pages. We know for a fact that some publications are seen as the good ones to have in place, and some publications are seen as the bad ones. This even extended to politics, where I think it was Republican politicians were having negative pages, whereas Democrats were having positive pages. And that was because the editors and the process that allowed it to happen was allowing Fox News to be featured as a source that you can't use for Wikipedia articles as sourcing, whereas you could use kind of like more liberal sources. So this also works the same for the UAP stuff as well. So, for example, you're allowed to use Scientific American as a source, just like, for Lue Elizondo's page, or, whether it be for Havana Syndrome or other things as well. But you can't use the Debrief, or you can't use the Daily Mail or Liberation Times. So that by itself kind of like makes the pages on Wikipedia very, very biased. And it also kind of like asks the question as well, is Scientific American part of this? Are critics intentionally trying to get into Scientific American, creating UAP articles that are very, very biased and opinionated, because they know that it will be featured on Wikipedia and it'll be able to influence a Wikipedia page. So in terms of the CIA's influence, it does beg the question, is that potentially happening? And then also I'd point as well to the fact that, Google's, I think, trust and safety team, it's been uncovered that major people on top of that team are former CIA. And just kind of like my experience as a journalist just kind of like goes there straight away. When we released the Office of Global Access story, straight away when it came out, there were a bunch of warnings, basically when that story came out, not to trust everything you read on this new breaking story. And I think you guys would have seen the same thing as well a few weeks ago when it came to some sightings in Palmdale of UFOs. Straight away, you got this warning from Google that there was a lot of information out there, a lot of it being fake. And that was before a splurge of fake videos started coming out showing drones over Hawaii. And it seemed to me that, the real witnesses to a potential UFO event and the real information was kind of like being drowned out by these sensationalist videos. And it always goes back to what George Knapp says, when it comes down to the UAP subject, the intelligence community is simply better at doing what it does than what we do. I always keep that in mind when I'm doing my investigations and when I'm thinking about the UAP topic. So, but once again, thank you so much for having me on. And by the way, Ryan, I love your ranch. Part of the reason I really got into the topic. So please don't stop, brother. And James, what you're doing as well. I find all your interviews so insightful. So thank you both.
And what's your publication? You gonna share your publication?
Oh, gosh, yeah, of course, yeah. So my publication is Liberation Times. So www.liberationtimes.com. You can also find me on Twitter as well. Chris UK Sharp is the handle. And I also do some freelance work for the Daily Mail as well with my colleague Josh Buswell. So you can find me in Liberation Times, or you can find me in the Daily Mail. I am not a journalist for the Daily Express or Reach PLC. A lot of people have been emailing me recently saying, I want to complain to you about this story. I didn't like this and like that. And I'm like, look, there's another journalist called Christopher Sharp, who's actually a really nice guy. And I've been speaking to him as well. And he just like covers a completely different topic to me. So please don't send me emails complaining. And likewise, don't send him stuff about UFOs complaining. We're two separate people, guys.
Awesome. And James, whatever you want to add, and go as long as you want.
I mean, I just want to say, generally, when it comes to all this, I'm optimistic. I'm excited about Lue's book, Imminent. I hope that it. Again, he was on Joe Rogan. Everybody was waiting for that Joe Rogan talk. It was great for Lue to kind of let loose and do like a 2-hour thing with Joe Rogan and get that kind of exposure. And I'm sure like little wins like that are going to have their own domino effect that we may not see play out for months, right? Whoever listens to that, we have no idea how that is going to affect them and what drive, maybe they might start their own podcast or some kind of initiative. You don't know what's going to happen. It might convince somebody who was an insider in some regard, maybe a military witness, to also come forward. So I think that there's been so much momentum built up, and I don't see it going anywhere. Everybody, it might have felt a little slow in the last few months, but all indicators are pointing to that there's going to be a lot of kind of UAP transparency activity. And I never advise that we get our hopes up, but at the same time, it's not, it's fine to be hopeful, right? And I think everybody has the ability to contribute to this one way or another, whether it's tweeting about it, talking to people in your social circle. I got a copy of Imminent just from our workplace that I keep up for there. If anybody who sees it is interested in it, I can rant on what it's about, or they can read it for themselves. Again, yeah, I mean, Ryan, I love what you do. I think your voice is very impactful, and it's funny, but it's very insightful at the same time. So it draws people in. So people who make disingenuous comments about how it's like overly silly. I mean, I think anybody looking at some of the parts that are funny knows, right? Like it's obvious that it's like some parts are meant to be funny. So I think those comments like that are disingenuous. Like, hey, come on, ultimately it's helping to spread a lot of awareness. So, and again, Christopher Sharp, breaking a lot of stories, that Office of Global Access story, man, I that was one of the most important stories in the last few years for sure. There's so much to that, and I hope more of that comes out soon. Lue Elizondo in Imminent wrote about the Wilson Davis memo, right, and the alien autopsy chain that Dr. Eric Davis confirmed to me was true, and to Richard Dolan, that both of these people were in the email chain, and they both confirmed that was a genuine email chain. So there's no disputing them. So in that email chain was the talk of Zodiac, right? And Zodiac was an alleged somebody who had some kind of information on these legacy programs and printed it in a fictional story in UFO magazine in the late 90s. And it's funny that in that that story, the individual said that the CIA had taken over the retrieval program as of the 1970s. So I found that as a very interesting correlation, because when you bring Zodiac up, like I have with Lue and Cullum and other people, you get an interesting response. So that, just that as a note. But again, I'm super optimistic. I think that the next few months should be eventful. My work, I have a lot of good interviews coming up. You can find anything about me on Engaging the Phenomenon, and I'm just happy to participate in the subject in any way I can.
Awesome. All right, everybody. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much for watching. Please do not forget to subscribe. If you'd like to support this channel, you can check out my merch shop where I sell t-shirts. You could become a patron. You could become a YouTube member. You can give me a one-time donation. All those potentialities can be accessed in the description box below. Or you can just slap a like on this bad boy and I will appreciate it so much. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Special thanks to all patrons, YouTube members, those that have bought merch, those that have given me a one-time donation. I couldn't do without you. Thank you so much. See you in the next episode.